Dude!
Please, Scooby-Doo this crap.
Wow. It's been a long time coming, guys. It has been a ridiculously long time that we have been waiting for a movie of this magnitude, for a movie that was this hyped up and had this much pressure on it in the MCU. I honestly can't remember since the last time. I believe it might have been Infinity War and Endgame, where a movie that had this much riding on it from a character, a narrative, a nuanced perspective was coming into the fold, into a specific portion of Phase 3, Phase 4, moving forward, where not only were we waiting for the conclusion of characters that we love, but we were waiting to see if the MCU could take big risks and have those pay off. And after seeing Spider-Man No Way Home for the second time now since release, I can honestly say this might be the very best live-action Spider-Man movie that I have ever seen, and I did not expect the movie to live up to expectations. So without further ado, let's talk about Spider-Man No Way Home and why Spider-Man No Way Home is the greatest accomplishment of Phase 4 for Marvel. There's a lot going into Phase 4. We have Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. We have potentially Loki Season 2. We've had a ton of TV shows and movies like Eternals and Shang-Chi that have come out. And what's more to come as what we expected from X-Men, potentially Fantastic Four. And we know that Black Panther 2 is also in the pipeline, but when we came into this movie, when we began the discussions around Spider-Man No Way Home, there was a lot riding on not only the potential career of Spider-Man in the MCU, but there was a lot riding on Tom Holland's portrayal of Peter Parker. One portrayal of which that I have actually been a huge fan of. I know a lot of people have not been super into Tom Holland's portrayal, but I find myself on the other side of the fence to where I was waiting for that gut punch to come through, for Tom Holland's Spider-Man to finally take the reins as the official Marvel Spider-Man, the rendition of the character that we all can get behind. And I have to say, after watching this movie, I think it's safe to call the race there. I think this might be the best live-action Spider-Man since Tobey Maguire's interpretation in the early 2000s. I'm not kidding. I think this movie might have done the impossible, and it really solidified Tom Holland as Spider-Man, but also his own individual Peter Parker, which was something that a lot of fans, even myself included, who love the character and love the portrayal, we're still waiting for. And I want to talk about why this movie worked. So going into this movie, right, we're expecting all of these massive villains and the hints of potentially more Spider-Man coming into this was something that was at the forefront of a lot of fans' attention, because it means so much for the potential multiverse that's opening up, but also how does Tom Holland and his Peter Parker bounce off of all these different threats, these different antagonists, protagonists, the side characters? Well, we're going to be talking about all of that. So spoiler warning ahead. If you haven't seen the movie, don't watch this video. Check out the other content on this channel and let me know what you think, but come back once you've seen it, because I've seen it twice, and I hope you guys have too, because man, it just gets better. So I made a video a couple of months back saying that the internet had spoiled and ruined No Way Home, because at the time we had found out about all of these returning villains. And while I think the marketing of this movie would have done better had they not released the information about, you know, confirming the leaks of Green Goblin and Doc Ock and Electro coming back into this movie, if they had kept that under wraps, I think it would have been much more of a unique surprise. But even going in, I was just shocked with how well the old characters and their old tones and the nuances they had in Sam Raimi's trilogy converted and transferred into the MCU. And a lot of that is due in credit to the incredible writing team and the producers and directors of this movie, because they took care with the characters and didn't just make them kind of punching bags for Peter Parker to play off of. They really paid attention to the small, subtle details of Doc Ock and how his three-dimensional character arc would transition into a scenario such as this, and then bringing in, you know, Norman Osborn yet again. Willem Dafoe just crushes it in this movie. He absolutely crushes his portrayal of Green Goblin. I mean, he gets better on the second watch, and that is something that I wasn't able to pick up on my first viewing, because I was lucky enough to go see No Way Home on basically opening night, and I was so enthralled in all of the action. I was so blown away by what was happening. It took me a couple of days to really come to grips with a lot of the themes and the acting in this movie, and I had to see it again to fully appreciate a lot of what was going on screen. A lot like how I treated Endgame, where I needed to see it a second time to fully engross myself in the story, and with that second viewing, it did help. And with this one, again, I just walked out of the theater. I am now sitting at my setup talking to you about Spider-Man No Way Home. The performances get better the second time around. It was heartbreaking looking at the pain and sacrifice and the victories of Tom Holland as he's fulfilling his role as Peter Parker, as Spider-Man. He is finally in the shoes of Peter Parker. He is finally taking on the sacrifice and the struggle of what we know this character to be. And it was so beautifully set up by John Watts and the entire ensemble, forgetting these different villains, these different characters with different themes and different ideas, and all of these far-reaching and extending motifs that come through from different movies and different storytelling perspectives that play such a critical role in the MCU now, because they are all canon, because the Sam Raimi trilogy is canon, because the Andrew Garfield 2 movies are canon, and how those characters help shape Peter Parker. I was telling one of my friends that it's not only that Tom Holland just has his best performance as Spider-Man in this movie. I mean, you see the anguish and the pain in his face. His acting is incredible, but what this movie does really well is it forces him to mature to different levels. He has to hit different depths. The dimensions, no pun intended, that he reaches in this film, in this role, a lot of that is helped with the supporting cast, because they help mold him, and he then takes that responsibility and he embodies it. He embodies being Peter Parker. He embodies what it means to be Spider-Man, which is to be in pain, which is to make the ultimate sacrifice so others can have a life. And I thought the entire cast of villains were just phenomenal in this movie. I mean, Doc Ock is fantastic. I love what they do with his character, giving him these small beats, these small moments where we can see kind of the canonical space between his action pieces, and we can really dive deep into the traditional sense of Doc Ock, into Otto Octavius before the chip malfunctioned in Spider-Man 2, and seeing him interact with other villains is quite interesting. But really, who steals the show in this is Green Goblin. And I did want originally more scenes with Willem Dafoe in the full Goblin outfit. I am one of those fans who actually didn't mind the original Green Goblin suit in the original movies. I thought it was quite menacing, and while he shows up in that same style, and I really loved seeing it on screen, the second viewing, I didn't have that small critique anymore, right? I wanted the movie to be longer because I wanted more scenes with the villains, like what we saw on the bridge with Doc Ock and Tom Holland's Peter Parker. But seeing the movie a second time around and really getting myself kind of engrossed now with knowing what's going to happen, being able to pay attention to the performances and the character beats, I didn't find myself as wanting, as yearning for some of those small interactions as I did the first time. And it was something that I was very surprised by, because I knew what was coming. I knew the big moments that were about to hit, and the emotion was still there. Aunt May's death still got me. I was crying in the theater. I did it again. And again, the attention to detail that we had so many moments where this film would slow down and really appreciate the moment. I was worried that comedy would interject too quickly and cut off the emotional fragility of some of these scenes, but instead, John Watts does a fantastic job of letting some emotional scenes breathe and letting Tom Holland act as Spider-Man. Let him act as the role. And then you bring in someone like Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin, who has easily become one of the top MCU villains. I mean, his performance was even more menacing and creepy and scary and terrifying than it ever was in the original trilogy. And what I loved about this character is that Green Goblin is the only villain in the MCU so far who had no other purpose except to cause pain and destruction just because he could. Other villains in the MCU had come in, and sure, they wanted world domination, sure, they wanted to conquer half the universe, or they had specific motives, but some of it was set up by a lot because of Tony Stark. They wanted a vendetta against Tony Stark. They wanted to overtake specific aspects of the identity of Iron Man. They wanted selfish reasons, but all of these things, there was some form of logic there. There was some form of, yes, it may be twisted, but I can understand why they're doing what they're doing. The Green Goblin was just pure evil. He was pure, I want to cause as much pain and destruction as possible. And I think it was so refreshing just to have someone who was purely out to do evil being stopped by a kid who had no other choice but to stand up in the moment because he had basically lost everything. The performance from Willem Dafoe and the interpretation and the continuation of Green Goblin in this movie is one of the best I've seen in any superhero movie, and coupling that with Alfred Molina's Doc Ock and Jamie Foxx's Electro and the other cast of Sandman, Electro, and Lizard, who the first time around I thought were very good, but they left a lot to be desired. They weren't really in the movie to do a whole lot, but the second time I could kind of sit with their characters. I could sit more with their reasonings. I could just be in the room. And when you're in the room and you get a chance to breathe with these characters, when you don't have to just get caught up in the action and the emotion and the constant back and forth, the ebb and flow of the movie, you start to appreciate the small subtleties in their performances, but also just accepting them as characters in this universe who maybe do have more of a purpose other than for fan service. And speaking of fan service, this movie does such an incredible job at finding ways to bring in nostalgia, but not make it nostalgia bait. It would have been one thing if they brought in Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield and Alfred Molina, Willem Dafoe, Jamie Foxx, Sandman, and I forget the actor's name who plays Lizard, and brought them in just for short cameos, but we actually get a movie centered around themes of each Spider-Man. We get movies centered around themes of these villains, and this felt like a love letter to Spider-Man fans like me, fans who have read the comics, fans from the Bronze and Silver and Golden Age and the Chromium Age of the 2000s and maybe the Foil Age of the 2010s. Like, we have been waiting for a movie like this, one that we got with Into the Spider-Verse, but something live action that kind of justified the investment we had made in Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. And not only did it do their characters justice, because a full circle has now been complete where the old films have a reason to exist outside of just existing by themselves, but what it did for Spider-Man is it showed us all of his unique sides. It showed us a terrified kid who is in way over his head trying to do right and save everyone, and he has to learn that maybe by not saving everyone, maybe by sacrificing all that he is, he has a chance to do some good. And even if that means he has to live in extreme pain and live in this uncomfortable lifestyle, that's what it means to be Spider-Man. That's the responsibility. And then we get Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, who brings in that constant innocence, right? That lovable, like, puppy dog, but at a moment's notice will sacrifice himself to take on an evil threat. We got all of these wonderful performances that carried their legacy from their respective films. Tobey Maguire was fantastic in this as always. I mean, he filled his role as a mentor to Tom Holland and really just being there to help flesh out the story, to help bring more color into the world of Tom Holland's Peter Parker at a moment in time where our Peter Parker, our MCU Peter Parker was in a world of black and white. He had just lost Aunt May. His whole world, his identity was crumbling, and he needed someone who has been through the trauma to help rebuild his identity. And that is where Andrew Garfield really helped steal the show. Andrew Garfield is his best in this movie. His best portrayal of Spider-Man is in this, because we get to see the pain that he's gone through. We hear the small dialogue. We hear the side talk of how he stopped pulling his punches, how he decided that rage and vengeance was a way of healing, but it wasn't the right course of action. It wasn't the right decision. And he's trying to get Tom Holland's Peter Parker to understand that is not the way to resolve your feelings. That is not the way to grow as Spider-Man. So having all three of them together, it could have been disastrous. We could have had a movie where it was just their movie, but I really felt that even with their presence, Tom Holland held his own. He was holding up a large part of this movie, and when they were involved, they were giving him advice and they were working together as a team. Through it all, Tom Holland was the one that stood out the most to me. He was the one who carried the emotional weight, carried the responsibility, the embodiment, the iconic nature of Spider-Man. And in the end, I found myself caring so much more about him as Spider-Man than I ever had in the MCU. And I loved his portrayal. I thought his portrayal of Spider-Man so far had been great. But this movie sent him over the top. And it would not have been possible had his acting not been... I don't often say that, superhero movies have acting that's like Oscar worthy, because I think all have been fantastic. I mean, when we look at some of the best in history, I look at Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. You look at Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Chris Evans as Captain America is criminally underrated. I think Tom Holland gave one of the best performances of a character this year in any movie. He was downright phenomenal, and he carried so much of this film. And he had to have his best performance in a movie that was so massive with so many other characters to prove to every doubter that he was Spider-Man, and finally, there is not a single person out there who can watch this movie, who should watch this movie, and one, not just be in love with the message of Spider-Man, with the beautiful canvas that this movie paints of loving and showing appreciation and admiration to this character, but I hope there's not a single person who watches this movie and is not sold on Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Tom Holland was phenomenal. I don't have enough words, and I'm still trying to process this movie 2 days later. I mean, again, I saw it opening night. I just saw it now. There's so many things going through my head. But what I can say is that this movie put Tom Holland through pain. This movie put Peter Parker through pain. That is one thing that he has yet to really go through outside of Vulture and Mysterio. And it even makes those past movies even better. It makes those past villains even better. But seeing Peter Parker team up with people like him who have felt that pain, and seeing the whole world go against him and him refusing to do anything but try to help others because Aunt May said with great power there must also come great responsibility. Again, it's so beautifully done and envisioned by the directors and envisioned by Marissa Tomei and the entire cast. It was just off the charts. The action scenes were fantastic. The fight with Doctor Strange in the mirror dimension was everything you'd want it to be. It was like pulled out of a comic book. But the final fight, it was just about Peter Parker fulfilling his story. This was one of the best Peter Parker stories we've ever had. If you want to look at some of the top examples, Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man the PS4 game, and No Way Home are the pinnacle of Peter Parker or Miles Morales Spider-Man stories. This is what it means to be Peter Parker, and Tom Holland crushed it. He absolutely crushed it. I know that I had said that this movie was going to get spoiled because of the leaks and stuff, but I did not expect this level of darkness, this level of nuance, depth, and innovation, and appreciation and seriousness in the character. They let Spider-Man be Spider-Man. They let Tom Holland be Peter Parker. They took him seriously, and he took every single moment of this film seriously. And the comedy wasn't too much. The action was fantastic. The innovations with each character were great. And in the end, I just found myself loving this movie as a Spider-Man fan and as someone who cares about Peter Parker. As someone who, finally sees a film like Into the Spider-Verse where I get it. I've always loved Peter Parker. I've always loved Spider-Man. But in the MCU, in live action, I had been waiting outside of Spider-Man 2, which is just a brilliant and masterclass film when it comes to emotional trauma and instability and personality. I had been waiting for a live action film since then to make me care deeply about being Peter Parker and being this kid. And finally, we have these movies, and I think that No Way Home might just be my favorite Spider-Man movie in terms of live action ever. I think it might have eclipsed Spider-Man 2. It's going to be really tough to put them against each other, but there is so much to love about this film. And that's what I take away, is that if you're a Spider-Man fan, there is so much to love about this movie. And I'm sorry that I'm rambling. Apparently that's what I do on my channel, and you guys love that. But I could not have been more impressed. And the movie only got better the second time. It only got better the second time I watched it. And I was able just to understand what was about to happen, but pay attention to the acting and the performances and really throw myself back into caring about the relationships. And the decision in the end, in the final few moments of this film, to not have Peter Parker tell MJ everything, to let him make the sacrifice of letting others be happy, even if it means he has to deal with this all on his own. It was such an important moment for Peter Parker because it's something that he would do. He lost Aunt May. He's losing everything around him. He has to fight villains he doesn't even know. He gets help from other universe versions of himself. And in the end, what he learns by not killing Goblin, what he learns from Tobey Maguire, what he learns from Andrew Garfield, is that being Peter Parker is tackling the mantle of responsibility, because that's what you do. That's who you are as Peter Parker, is you have to live in pain. And if you can accept that, and you can do what Tobey Maguire said, which is, this is what we do, you are Peter Parker. You are Spider-Man. You are worthy of the mantle. And he chooses not to tell MJ about everything they've been through. He leaves. He gets his own apartment. He finally is by himself in his own bubble, makes his own suit, and ends the film on one of the best conclusive trilogies in the MCU. I think Captain America still holds the #1 spot, but not only did No Way Home make Far From Home and Homecoming even better films that I already thought were great, but it made Spider-Man one of the best heroes in the MCU. Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Peter Parker, those are some of the very best. Thor as well. Those are some of the very best heroes in the MCU, and Spider-Man was just phenomenal. Spider-Man No Way Home, the more I think about it, in so many ways, this movie is a masterpiece. I am so sorry for the ramble. I hope that you guys enjoyed this movie as much as I did. There were small gripes I had, but watching it a second time, a lot of those gripes became inconsequential. I just didn't care anymore. I was so enthralled and just sucked into this action. And not only were the villains a love letter to the old villains and the action was fantastic, but the emotion of this movie, it lets you feel distress and pain and tension, and it lets you feel it all just brutally. It's raw. This movie is violent. It's dark. This movie takes Spider-Man seriously, and Tom Holland is absolutely he's Spider-Man. He's Spider-Man, guys. Tom Holland is our Spider-Man. I'm so happy I can say that. He freaking crushed it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys enjoyed Spider-Man No Way Home. I'd love to know what you thought in the comment section below. I wanted to come in this with an analytical approach, which I guess I will do in a character breakdown at some point of this character. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me on this channel. I know it's been a while, but I had to rant. I love this movie. This is one of my favorite Spider-Man movies ever, one of my favorite Marvel movies ever. And it gets better every time I watch it. It's just, this movie is, no pun intended, amazing. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bam!